What's up, folks? Spencer here with React Native School. Today I just want to walk you through the process of writing tests for a screen. So I've got the sign-in screen here, and if we look over at my test file, I've just got it set up to make sure I know I've got Jest and React Native testing library / React Native set up. I've done no other prep for this. So to preface this, if you're looking for something refined and super uh, value for every second you're getting, this isn't going to be the video for you. If I could figure out how to live stream, this would have been a live stream. But I just want to walk you through the process of going from I have this screen, it does some stuff, and I want to write tests for it to make sure it does that in the future. Walk you through that entire process. No idea how long it'll take, but with all those warnings out there, let's go ahead and get started. Now, like I said, we're just going to be focusing on writing tests for this signin.js. I use a few other components in here, and we can cover that stuff, but we won't be doing that in this video. Today we're just focusing solely on this login screen and making sure its functionality continues. So, as I said, I do have Jest set up already. Yarn test, we can set that up, and we've got it watching for any tests. So we know our setup is good. We can just focus on writing our tests here. So first thing I want to do, figure out what am I actually testing here. And styles doesn't really matter. Our use login form state. Now this is a custom form or a custom hook that basically just manages the username, password, submit state, and then it determines if a password or a username or password is valid or not. In this case, because it's just an example, the only way to have a valid username is to have it set as example. Only way to have a valid password is to have it set as ASDF. I've got some stuff set up here, and then finally I've got a submit function that when you submit, if both the username and password are valid, we'll go ahead and make a fetch request to a sample API. It does nothing, but once that completes, we'll go ahead and push a new screen. Now, you may think, okay, I need to write tests for this, and you could, but in the case of this, there's no reason for me to write any tests related to this form state, because basically everything that we see here, or the output of all of this, will be represented in another way. We'll go through and write all of our test descriptions here in a moment, but just to give you a quick rundown on what this looks like. So if I were to press login now, we're going to see our form show errors. We've got invalid username and invalid password. If I type in a valid username, it'll go ahead and go away. Likewise, if I type in a valid password and I hit login, we'll go ahead and go to a new screen. So these are all the things that I want to write tests for this screen. Okay, so looking down here, basically we've just got these inputs and then we've got this error text. So this is all kind of what we're looking to test. So first things first, you can see I've got this, it renders example, but basically first thing I want to do, let's actually go ahead and refresh this so we start at a clean slate. Okay, it's freezing on me. Okay, we're good here. So first thing, let's make sure it renders the default elements. Oh, this thing is having an issue. Okay, so we're going to write a test. It renders default elements, and we'll go through and fill in all these tests later on. Next thing, what is going to happen? If we've got an invalid username, we want to see that it shows the invalid username. If it's invalid, shows invalid username error. Message shows invalid password error message. Actually, let's just make this one test. Shows invalid input messages. And then let's also set it up so that we've got individual tests for each one of these so that if we just have an invalid username but we do have a valid password, all that. What else? Let's see. So working down, we've got our default state where we're just making sure everything's actually rendered. We're checking our username and password if we've got those errors. Next thing. Okay, so on submit, what happens from a user's perspective? What are they going to see on submit? So when we hit submit, if they've got a invalid username or invalid password, they're going to see error messages. We've stubbed out tests for that. If it is valid though, we want to make sure fetch is called. So let's say it handles valid input submission. Okay, and then we'll go through and fill that out. We'll want to make sure we've got a fetch. We go into response.json, and then we also do a navigation.push. Okay, I think we've got the initial tests I want to write here. Okay, so it renders the default elements. Let's go ahead and fill out this test. Okay, I've got my terminal running, or my tests running here. So let's go ahead and write these tests. So first thing, we'll make sure all the elements we're looking for are on the screen. So I want to go ahead and do a destructuring off this render. And if you're not familiar with the testing library / React Native API, I've got it pulled up here. But basically we've got get by, get all by, query by, and find by. I want to use get by and get all by because I want to make sure those elements actually exist because we're looking for them. So what we can do is say we've got login here and we've also got login, the text, down on the button. So let's go ahead and grab a get all by text. And I want to make sure that get all by text of login, we want to make sure that the length of that is equal to 2. That 2b 2. So if we look at our test, it's running. Cool, that works. If I were to remove this first login, our test should fail. Wonderful, it does. So we're making sure we've got that login there. Is that a super useful test? That's up in the air, but it is there. So next thing, let's make sure our inputs are actually rendered. And rather than using like a test ID for this, I like to use the get by placeholder input because the user's actually seeing the placeholder. So we've got this example placeholder or these 3 stars placeholder. So I want to use the get by placeholder text. I actually just want the get by. So the difference between get all by and get by is get by will return the first element, get all by will return an array of all matching elements. There's only one instance of each one of these inputs, so I'm just going to use get by text. Get by placeholder text. So get by placeholder text, I expect example to show up. And it is. And then I also expect my placeholder text of 3 stars to show up. Now, we could also do an assertion that username shows up and password shows up just to make sure that those are the right labels showing up. But basically, I just want to make sure these elements are showing up, and I don't care about all of the implementation of this input. That can be tested on the input component itself, that it has this API that I care about. I just want to make sure that my inputs are being rendered because the input's where the user is actually entering data on this screen. So I'm targeting kind of that underlying component that the user is actually going to be interacting with on this screen, which is the text input. Okay, so I think that should be everything. So if we look at our tests, it is passing. So I think we're seeing that all of our default elements are working. Now let's do a shows invalid input messages. So I'll set up my test. We're going to do the same render. This time, so if I were to press this button, simulate what's going to happen here. Oh, it's freezing on me again. I don't think my computer's happy about recording and running the app at the same time. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and restart this. Like I said, this is a raw video. There's no editing going on. So while that's happening, something we're going to have to do here is actually interact for, and we're going to need to grab the fire event. So I'm going to import or fire event function from the core library. So I'll go ahead and grab that. Okay, so if I press this button again, you can see we expect these two messages to show up, invalid username and invalid password. So what I want to do, I need to figure out a way to target this button. And previously we had looked just for the text, but this time what I want to do is actually, I'm going to use the test IDs just because I can target this button in particular because it does have the same text in the header and the button. So I'll go ahead and add a test ID. I'm going to say sign in dot button. So let's go ahead, destructure this again, and I want to get a get by test ID. Then I want to press fire event get by test ID. Actually, this should be a fire event dot press. It's a press event. And I want to grab the sign in dot button. See what happens. Okay, so we're seeing no instances found with test ID. What I'm wondering is if this button component is not actually forwarding down that test ID that I passed. So it isn't. So I'm going to make a quick modification to this component. I'm just going to go ahead and grab any remaining props and just tack that onto this touchable opacity. So dot props. So I'll just spread those remaining props down onto it. Now our test should run. Okay, so now we're able to actually interact with this specific button. Next thing we want to do is after we've run this, we want to make sure that our error messages show up. So we'll also grab get by text, and I want to make sure that get by text invalid username. I think that's the error message. Yeah, invalid username and invalid password show up. Let's see this test run. Okay, cool. So this test is passing if both inputs are empty. Next, let's go ahead and write a test where we actually type in some values here. So we're interacting with our inputs. So it shows invalid username error message. So I basically want to do exactly this. But before I press this button, I'm going to type into my input. So let's figure out what that API is for fire event. Is there an easier way? Okay, so there was convenience methods for press, change text, and scroll. So we'll use change text. What we'll want to do is grab the placeholder input. Is there a better way that I could test this? Because basically this isn't very descriptive. And this could change. I don't want to have to update all of my tests if I change the placeholder text because it's not super important. And I've got one test making sure that what I expect the user to see is being seen. So now that I'm just testing the interaction, I think I want to do a get by test ID for this password input. So what I'm going to do is get by test ID. I'm going to call this sign in dot password input. Then I'm going to want to do a fire event dot change text. So we target the element first, and second, I want to add an input. I'm going to add a valid input here, which is ASDF. Fire event.change text. We're getting this input. When I press the button, we should see the message of invalid username still. But then if we do a query by text, I don't want to see invalid password. So I expect the length of that. Actually, I should do a query all. Query by text.length. Let's try this. Is that 2b0? I need to wrap that in an expect. The reason I don't wrap get by text in an expect is this is going to throw an error if that doesn't exist. So I don't need to add an assertion through just to make sure that happens, I'll get an error anyways. So let's see what happens. This test is going to fail because we don't have this test ID yet. But let's just double check. Okay, it is throwing an error and it's showing on this line. No instances found with signin.password input. So let's go ahead and add that. We'll add a test ID equal to the signin.password input. Let's make sure our input passes that down. It does. We can use that same prop spreading we were using before. Okay, and we're seeing a type error. So slow it down there, Spencer. Basically, we're now interacting with our input. We're pressing the button, and now we're seeing the error thrown on this query by text. It's telling me cannot read property length of null. And basically, instead of query by text, I want to do query all by text so that I get an array back of an empty array because there shouldn't be anything that passes, that matches invalid password. And I did not import query all by text, so let's grab that. Okay, cool. And if you ever want to just figure out if you're actually doing things right, you can go ahead and grab a debug. And if we drop that in here, you can see what that rendered output is that React Native or testing library / React Native is actually looking at to make its assertion. So if we look here, we can see our login button, and above that we see our error text. We do see invalid username. We don't see invalid password anywhere. We see our inputs, and we see our header text. So we're seeing everything that's going on there. So everything looks right. And as I write that, I actually want to expand on shows invalid input messages. Right now, we're just testing if this works for an empty input. Do I want to add a test based on if basically it doesn't pass the client-side validation. So it's possible it couldn't pass the server-side validation. What about the client-side? And client-side validation here is basically, is it equal to example or ASDF? And another example could be, is the username or password long enough to pass, a known set of rules that you just put on the client side so you don't have to wait on the server. Let's go ahead and add one of those. Let's see, how do I want to do this? So we'll do the same thing we've got down here. Let's go ahead and add a test ID to our username input. Test ID is equal to signin.username input. Okay, so what I want to do now, let's just copy, or would it make more sense to go down in here? Okay, shows invalid username error message. Okay, it actually makes more sense to go down here. So we've entered our password input. We've got a valid password. We press the sign in button. We get by text invalid username, and we expect invalid password not to show up. Let's go ahead and interact with this input again, or with our username input. Let me grab that. So let's interact with the username password, and I'm just going to type in invalid input. Right? We know that's not going to pass our validation per se. This time, I still expect invalid username and query all by text to be there, or invalid username to be there, but I still don't expect an invalid password to show up. Let's check our tests running. Perfect. Looks good. Now let's go ahead and do the exact same thing for our password input. So we know we're going to need to render our component. We're going to type into our username input this time. So I'll go ahead and type into my username input. This time I'm going to enter a valid input, which is just going to be example. Next, if I were to go and press the button, the submit button, let's go ahead, copy this over. This time I expect invalid password to be showing up, but I expect invalid username to not be there. So if I run this test, okay, that's passing. Let's go ahead and do the same thing we did here, where we actually type into the input to make sure validation still works. Fire event change text, we want this to be password input. I'll still leave, this isn't right, password input. I'm still going to leave invalid input as the input to that because it's still invalid. Then if I run this, we can see our test fail, no instances found with text invalid username. Oh, okay, so our test is working. It's telling us that there are no instances of invalid username because there aren't. There should be an instance of invalid password error text shown. And then if we switch this one around to invalid username dot length to be 0, our test should pass. And it does. So we've got all of like our, are we rendering what we expect? Are we doing our client-side validation? We've got those tests showing up. And you can see everything I'm doing here is basically what is the user actually seeing on the screen. So if they were to type in invalid input, they're seeing invalid username showing up. I'm testing that they see what I expect them to see versus kind of like how everything works. So with that all said, we've kind of got the client-side stuff done. What happens when they pass in a bunch of valid data and we go ahead and then submit that? What happens then? That's what this handles valid input submission is. So handles valid input submission. We know we're going to want to render our component. And we need to type in valid input. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this stuff. So we need to type in a valid input for the username, the password input, so example in ASDF, and then we go ahead and submit. When I run this test, it should pass because it's not testing anything at this point. Oh, okay, actually it's throwing an error. Reference fetch is not defined. So we actually need to mock this, which I forgot to do before this. So I'm going to look up just fetch mock. Go ahead and install this. Yarn add -- dev jest fetch mock. We're going to create a setup jest file. Just going to call this setup jest.js, in which we're going to return fetch mock, enable that, and then I need to actually run this before my jest setup occurs. And I can do that in setup files after env. This is all in the documentation. Actually, it should be just setup files. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that, paste that into my jest config. Let's see, yarn test -- watch. So basically with that, I mocked out the fetch API that we know through basically web development or React Native development. Okay. So we're seeing a new error. That's cool. Let's start working with that. So we're pressing the button. What we need to do now is actually look at what is our app doing. So if we fetch, so we submit this, everything's valid. Is username is valid, is password is valid. We're hitting our fetch API. Basically, we need to mock a response for this. So what we can do, again, going over to the documentation. Okay, we want to mock our response once. So let's go ahead and say fetch.mock response once. How do we do this? Okay, so I need to stringify a response that we're going to use. So I'll just go ahead and tack in a json.stringify. passes true. That's all. I don't care what the response is in this case. I just want to fetch some or mock something so that our test should pass now. Okay, cannot read property push of undefined. So we're getting new errors. Let's go back over to sign-in.js. Whoa, don't know what I did there. Okay, sign-in.js. So we're doing our fetch going on. Okay, we have this navigation.push. This is perfect. This is something we want to test, that if we get through all of this, we want to make sure we actually push to our app. So let's see. We need to actually mock that. And if we look at this, if we look at our component, we're expecting a navigation prop coming into it, so we can go ahead and mock that. What I want to do is say push mock is equal to jest.fn. That allows us to run assertions against this function. So I can say navigation is equal to an object. And this is, you kind of have to be familiar with the React Navigation API to know this, but navigation is going to pass an object down. We're calling the push method on that, so we can go ahead and just pass in that push mock to it. So now if we run this, I think it shouldn't give us an error. Okay, it doesn't, but now we can start running assertions against this. So if we look here, we're successfully mocking our fetch. And once we've successfully gotten a response back from that, we expect our navigation.push to be called with app. So if I take a look at push mock, lg push mock, okay, we can see all kinds of different stuff here. Basically, what we're interested in is this .mock. So I can say push mock.mock. We should get a calls array in here. If we look at .calls, oops, should be with an S. Okay, push mock.mock.calls. I'm not seeing anything, so that's actually an error. Let's go ahead, write an assertion against this. Expect push mock dot to be called with app, right? Because I expect push to have been called with app. To be called with is a jest assertion. Yeah, basically, I don't know. This is something you'll learn as you write more and more jest stuff, these different APIs that you can use. So if I look at this, okay, we expect it to be called with app, but it never gets called. What's wrong here? Well, what's happening here is we're entering our inputs, we're pressing the button, and we're immediately running this assertion on our push mock. The problem with this, though, is that if we look at our sign-in, this is a promise, right? So it takes some amount of time. It's basically instant, but it's not basically within the same tick that our test is running with. So even though we expect navigation.push to have been called, it has not yet been called at this point. So we need to basically wait for our promises to resolve before we actually make this assertion here. So first thing we want to do is actually turn this test into a promise itself. And we can do that by just prefixing the actual function definition with async, allowing us to use async await here. So now we need to figure out, what do we await for? And I don't actually remember. So let's go to the API and see. Okay, what is wait for? I think wait for is going to be waiting for something to show up on the screen. And unfortunately, nothing actually shows up on the screen once we wait for this. So this one isn't going to quite work for us. I think the other is act. Let's see, that might work. Actually, let's go ahead. And Google it. Wait for promise to resolve jest. There's a way I used to do this. React Native testing library. Okay, our async utilities. It's deprecated. It's a loud alarm. Okay. So this is all deprecated. I don't want to use that. Okay. I wrote some code recently. Let me find it. Promise this won't take long. So basically we want to simulate waiting for that promise to resolve. The way we do this, I'm looking through the React Native community Slack, because I know we covered this recently. Okay, here, this is what we need to do. Like I said, this is unplanned stuff. Okay, so we want to use this act that we saw defined over here. So we want, basically, we want to wait for something to happen, and we want to basically basically we want to wait for our test to resolve, for our promise to resolve. I don't know how exactly to describe this. Basically, let's go and just write it. Maybe I can explain it better then. So I want to await act, which I need to go ahead and import from testing library / React Native. Now, what am I waiting for here? Well, I want to wait for a new promise, and that's going to take a resolve function. Basically, if I set immediate and pass in that resolve function so it's called immediately, I still don't know how to explain this. But basically, this is going to wait for our promises to resolve, which, if we see here, we've got multiple promises resolving before it actually does this assertion. So we're going to wait for this chain to complete before we run this test. And this is like something that I pull into a function and I have set up in my tests. So if we look at our tests, it should be passing now. And it is. So I hate that I don't know how to explain this, but I didn't really plan for this. Like I said, this was going to be a live stream if I could figure out how to do it. Basically, this is a really useful utility function for whenever you're working with promises. And if you've used React Native Testing Library in the past, you may know this as, I think it's flush micro task queue. Okay, yeah, so it's just not allowing us to import it. It's a deprecated API, but it's still super useful, and I think the reason it was deprecated is because this is all it was. You can just define that in your app. So what I always like to do is grab this flush micro task queue. I'll create a function and a file I normally import within my tests. I just go ahead and drop this in here. Flush micro task queue, and then I just drop that into my act. So I just wait for that. My test should still pass. Whoops, this is going to cause an error. It's already been declared. Did I import it? Okay, yeah, so you can import it. I'm pretty sure that API has been deprecated, so I always just define it myself. But flush microtasks queue, and that's flushing the task, or the queue of tasks. That queue being our fetch, converting that response into JSON, and then finally our push. So kind of went off the rails here at the end. But we're waiting for our response. Let's make sure it actually runs. I think I've broken things now. Oh, I was looking at the wrong thing. Okay, our tests are passing here. So we're making it through this chain. Oh, jeez. Okay. We've made it through this chain of tests. We've added our inputs. When we press submit, we're going through this chain. We're making a fetch response or fetch request. We're then converting it. And then finally we're checking that navigation.push is called. Actually, another assertion we can make is making sure it's actually making a request to fetch to the right URL. Since we're mocking the fetch library, we can go ahead and take a look at fetch.mock.calls. And we're doing this before our flush microtask queue because this is happening before any promises start. If I run that and take a look at it, we can see we are making a call to /users. So let's say we expect our fetch API dot to be called with, let's see if I can just do a regex here. We expect it to be called with /users. Yeah, we won't use the root level API, but let's see if we can just use a regex to look if it's calling /users. Okay, and to be called with doesn't work like that. I'm sure it does somehow. Let's look it up. To be called with regex. Okay, we want expect string.match. I actually don't know regex, so I'll just trust this. /users. Let's see if this works. Oh, okay, so it's... Okay, here. This is another way I cheat. Basically because fetch is passing a bunch of stuff. We're passing a URL, we're passing a method, we're passing a body. I don't want to have to test all of that. I don't want to have to define all that. So I like to just say expect fetch.mock.calls.toMatch snapshot. And that should go ahead and write a snapshot for us, which it did. Let's go ahead and look at that. Okay, now we're seeing basically what are we getting from this snapshot? We're getting a request URL and the body that is actually going along with it. So I think we're good here. Is there anything else I'd write a test for? So we're testing our client-side validation. We're showing our errors. We're testing that when we submit a valid input, going and making a request to the right URL, we're passing the right method, the right body, we're converting that response, and then we're calling navigation.push to our app. So everything's running here. What if Joe Schmo comes into my app and he says, post is stupid, this should be a put? Well, if I put this in here, maybe their API doesn't support a put. It only expects a post. Now, if he changes that, we can see our automated tests fail. That's something I've missed in code reviews. Post change to a put, but our tests are showing, this is an issue. Let's investigate this further. So if I change this back to a post, that works. Or maybe username, instead of passing the username, I accidentally pass a string of username. Well, if I run this test again, we'll see that our snapshot's not matching once again. Test is showing us that it's working correctly. We're not passing the data we expect to this API. It's not being passed correctly. Or maybe Joe Schmo once again is in here changing the set function, and instead of yet set username, he's passing it to just an anonymous function in there. So we've got all of our tests passing. If I save this, that implementation of set for username changes. Our test should fail, and that's because we're expect query all. Basically, this is our client side error message, shows invalid password error message. We're seeing an invalid username error message when we don't expect to. Why is that? Well, we can find this here. So these are all the tests, or the baseline level of tests I'm going to write for something like a sign-in screen in a React Native app. If you've got more questions, this I think is a subject I really, really want to go deep on through React Native School. I'd love to hear your testing related questions on React Native. So feel free to leave a comment or reach out to me on Twitter, become a React Native School member, and we'll talk about this kind of stuff on Slack. That's kind of what inspired this video. if you found this video valuable, even though it's very raw and uncut, go ahead, give a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and yeah, check out React Native School. I hope you found this valuable, and I'll see you on the next one.